Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Courtside with Beilinson Tennis, part of the Tennis Channel Podcast Network. We are so happy to have with us Jeff Sackmann, an author and software developer who has worked in the field of sports statistics and is also the creator of Tennis Abstract. Jeff recently came up with a list of 128 best tennis players of all time, which is a combination of both men and women. And as we know, my co-host is one of the great historians of the game, and Steve Flink. We cannot wait to get into this list with Jeff. It is our privilege to welcome to the Courtside with Beilinson Tennis Pod, Jeff Sackmann. Jeff, thanks for spending time and going over your background and also this list that you compiled. That is no small feat, what you tried to accomplish there.
No, and I know Steve can tell you all about it. I should probably defer to him on any questions of tennis history, but I'm the guest, so I have to pretend like I'm the expert.
That's good advice. So before we dive into the 128 list, if you don't mind, tell us a little bit about your background. Did you grow up playing sports? How did you become involved in statistics? We know you do statistical analysis stuff on sports beyond just tennis, baseball specifically as well. Give the listeners a little bit of background about yourself.
Yeah, I played baseball and tennis growing up, and I was okay. I wasn't great. Got into some other stuff, and eventually I sort of followed the wave into sabermetrics in baseball when Moneyball came out and people started doing all that stuff. And I started a website that broke down minor league baseball statistics, and a fan of that site who became a friend, he proposed doing the same thing for college baseball. So we did that and turned it into a business, which is what I've been doing for almost 20 years now, 15, 16 years. We sell college baseball data to Major League Baseball teams, and that's my day job. And about a decade ago, I had gotten a little burned out on the baseball stuff and thought I'd, go back to tennis. I was playing a lot of tennis in those days, and I wanted to try some statistical analysis on tennis, see what was out there. And I discovered there wasn't much. I mean, this is 2010 we're talking about. So the live score sites for bettors like that wasn't really out there that much. A lot of the sites that we use every day either didn't exist or existed only in a sort of preliminary form. The ATP and WTA websites were more frustrating than they are these days. So I wanted a database, I wanted some analytics, and it seemed like for the most part, if that was going to happen, I needed to do it myself. And that's ultimately what I ended up doing. And that's what Tennis Abstract is it's kind of the website that I wish I had found when I was Googling around in 2010 or 2011. And my model is always the amazing baseball sites and baseball research that's been done, like baseballreference.com. Any baseball fan has baseball/.reference.com ingrained in their fingers because they type it so often. And I mean, if I can be like 1% of that website, then, that's a dream come true. It's just such amazing stuff that's out there. And we're getting there with tennis. I mean, it's a baby steps, but we're making a little progress towards that goal.
And the website is simply tennisabstract.com. And you can get a lot of the information that we're going to talk about today with Jeff. Steve, anything preliminary before we dive into Jeff's creation of the 128 list, of his parameters, how he came up with his method, or should we dive right into it?
Well, no, I just would want Jeff to explain a bit, because I learned a bit about it just by reading his pieces and looking at his rankings and having spoken to him on the phone and emailed once or twice, that you have this ELO system. You have a system. I want the listeners today to get a gauge on how you went about that system, because obviously that was the key to the whole project. It wasn't you making a judgment call as a tennis diehard, great observer of the sport or someone delving into the history, but you had a system that you followed that it resulted in your 128. Can you explain how that system worked and how you were able to combine men and women and be fair to both the men's and women's games?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have even dared to make a judgment call this deep. I mean, once you get past the top 10 or 20 in tennis history, it's really hard if you're going purely on judgment. So one of the things that Tennis Abstract has gotten kind of known for is the tennis ELO ratings. And ELO ratings have been around for chess for a half a century now. And The 538 website has popularized ELO ratings for other sports, and I've implemented them for tennis. A few other people have implemented them for tennis as well. And the idea with ELO ratings is you reward players for who they play and how they play against them. It doesn't work like the ATP or WTA rankings. It doesn't give more credit for beating Nadal at the Australian Open rather than beating Nadal at Acapulco. If you beat Nadal, you beat Nadal, period. You get the same amount of points for that. You don't get more credit because it's the semifinals instead of the first round. Like, it's about who you play and whether you win or lose. That's it. And all my research has borne out the fact that that's what's important. I mean, if you want to predict future results, you care more about who you've beaten and who you lost to, not when it happened. So with that in mind, I built a database of the entire last 100+ years of tennis history, men's and women's, and came up with a peak ELO rating for every player and a year-end ELO rating for every season for every player. And from there, you can do a bunch of stuff. What I wanted to do with this list was, this is again something I borrow from baseball researchers, is to try to balance peak performance with career-long longevity type performance. So someone like Maureen Connolly was amazing, but only for a few years. And then there's some other players like Conchita Martinez, who you don't think of as amazing because she didn't have that just incredible like Little Mo or Steffi Graf type peak, but was really, really good for a long time. So the way my algorithm handled all that was to have three components. One was peak ELO, just how good was the player at their very, very best. Second, their whole career. So every season that they topped a certain threshold, give them credit for every single one of those seasons. The third component was their best 7 years, sort of a halfway between those two. And then I converted every one of those three ratings into a percentile score. So for Steffi Graf, it was like 99.9th percentile in peak and 97th percentile for career. And I don't remember the exact numbers, but you get the idea. And once you have those numbers in percentile terms, you can compare men and women directly. So obviously, you've got to turn it into numbers somehow. You can't make a judgment call of Laver versus Graf or Emerson versus Novotna or whatever. But what you can do is convert them into numbers and just turn it into a list. So that's what I did. So when I say that, Monica Seles is number 11 and Bjorn Borg is number 12, that's what I mean. I'm saying Seles is a tiny bit stronger relative to all other women than Bjorn Borg is relative to all other men. I'm not pretending like I can make any direct comparison between the two, but I think that's a fair way of doing it, and a way of reflecting the fact that tennis history has always mixed the genders more than other sports. And that's one of the rewarding and often fun things about it.
Did you consider, Jeff, at the outset, maybe breaking it down to 64 men, 64 women for your 128? Obviously, it would have been very difficult, I suppose, to do 128 for each. Was that something you gave serious thought to, or were you determined to mix the men and the women?
I didn't think about it as much before I started as I have since. This is one of the most common things people have asked me about or started. It didn't even really cross my mind. It was obvious to me that this is how I wanted to do it. So it took me a lot longer.
Go ahead.
Did you lose me?
No, we're going to continue on.
Okay. My list was based on Joe Posnanski, the sports writer's baseball 100. And I thought I'd do a tennis 100, but then that felt like ripping him off a little bit. So then I'd do a tennis 101, or then I was thinking a tennis 108, since that'd be like a set score of 10-8 in the fifth. Then I was like, that's dumb. No one will get that. And then I got to 128. It's like, well, that's a lot of work, but hey, 128 is a good tennis number. It's a good math number too. So here we are. And the thing, like I say, I've thought about it more since I finished than I did when I started.
Let's again, kudos to you for even trying to do this. I appreciate you explaining the objective criteria. Steve and I were looking at the list, and we were talking a few things. We could spend hours on a bunch of these. There were 2 or 3 specifically that I'd like to focus on, and one being someone near and dear to Steve's heart is Pete Sampras. Steve wrote the book Pete Sampras' Greatness Revisited, the 14 Slams. When we looked at this list, we noticed that Yvonne Lendl was 20 and Pete Sampras was 21. I know you've talked about this with others. I would be surprised if that order was not brought up to you, how that came to be. I think on its face, most people would say he has had a better career than Ivan Lendl. So why don't you go ahead and I'll let Steve obviously chime in. Steve is super close to this subject matter. Talk about that ranking with Ivan being 20 and Pete being 21.
Well, there's a few things going on. One is that so much of Sampras's reputation is based on his slam count. I mean, deservedly so. I mean, he targeted those Wimbledon and US Open titles and he did it. So, I mean, kudos to him. And I should just say, I mean, before I explain the pros and cons of both, like I don't love being in the position of saying, well, this is why he's lower than you think. Like if somebody's on this list, I mean, obviously it's in the title. They're one of the greatest players of all time. I mean, it should be a compliment. So I don't want to rip on anybody. So what Sampras doesn't have that a lot of the guys above him, and specifically Lendl has, was success on clay. And what that turns into, as the algorithm sees it, is a huge chunk of the season that he wasn't winning. And Lendl had that a little bit. We know he struggled on grass, but Lendl had seasons where basically it was one match at Wimbledon that he lost, and that was about it. I mean, he had some just outrageous seasons. And one of the things that really stands out about the top 10 and most of the top 20 people on this list is if you look at their career record season by season, they're going to have a chunk of season somewhere in their career where they lose like 4 matches a year or 6 matches a year, something just like you can't even really fathom it. And Sampras didn't have that much. I mean, not taking anything away from what he did accomplish, but he never had a string of just unbeatable seasons. And a big part of that was because of the surface. So I'm sure you could come up with an algorithm that would reward people more for performance on their best surface specifically. And there's a lot of algorithms you could generate that would put Pete higher, no question. But mine, the way I constructed it, rewards all around performance more than having a single surface or two where you excel. And that's the difference. I mean, it's super, super close. 20 versus 21, 50 versus 51 on this list. I mean, they're basically tied. But if you have to boil it down to one thing, it's the fact that Lendl had those all surface, just ridiculous dominant seasons.
So it's
Steve?
interesting. You had a very set criteria, a very clear system in mind, and obviously you didn't. It wasn't a question of any emotional attachment to any player. You just let the information fall where it did. But obviously, somebody listening to you now would say, "But wait a minute, Lendl never won Wimbledon." Lendl was certainly not regarded as one of the great grass court players. Or they would say, how can John McEnroe, with a record like his, even though it was a phenomenal doubles record and a very great singles record too, be also ahead of Pete? People are going to look at these things, but you're saying that maybe just go into a little more detail, not just about Sampras versus Lendl or Sampras versus McEnroe or any of those. How much weight, for instance, did you put on the slams? How much weight did it matter? For instance, Sampras was number 1 for 6 years in a row, setting a record. Did players' ability to be at the top of the sport for long periods, did that weigh into the, just so people get a better gauge? Because there'll be some surprising there are some surprises. You said to me on the phone, a lot of people were jarred by Rafael Nadal at number 8. That seemed really low for him. And obviously Pete being where he is. So explain that, a little more detail about the information itself and how it was weighted.
Yeah. The things you mentioned that are sort of the stock in trade debates, I literally ignored them. So slam count, I ignored it. Weeks at number 1, ignored it. Not part of it at all. Now, if you win a slam, I mean, Sampras did it so many times. He won 7 matches in a row, many of them against very good players. So since I am using ELO ratings exclusively, that helps his ELO rating a ton. I mean, there's nothing better you can do at a slam for any kind of rating than win all the matches. So he did that and it works out great. And if you look at what would happen if you just line up players by how many slams they won or how much time they spent at number 1, obviously there's some, but the idea is purely go by match results. So if you won, 30 matches in your career at Queen's Club against a certain set of 30 players, that's worth exactly the same amount as winning the same 30 matches against the same 30 opponents at Wimbledon. No difference. And I get that we've been trained from an early age to treat Wimbledon and Queen's Club like different things. I watch them like different things. I know players approach them as different things, but all my research says that if somebody wins those 30 matches at Wimbledon versus winning those 30 matches at Queen's Club, the predictions you make about how well they play in the future are identical. They should be identical. If you're betting on the matches, they should be identical. And what that means to me is I'm trying to rate how good they were at tennis, not how much they racked up the right trophies or had we're in the position for the most prominent press conferences or appearances on Letterman or whatever. And to me, that means Queen's Club stacks up with Wimbledon. I mean, that it's a weird thing to say, and I know people will disagree with that even more than some of the rankings that I have. But ultimately, it's all about stripping away the round numbers, stripping away the tournaments, and just treating it like a list of matches where you beat the players you beat and you lost the players you lost to the players you lost to. And that gives you a ranking. And
that's interesting, Jeff, though, because
yeah.
I mean, I think everyone would say that certain players put more emphasis on certain tournaments. That's obvious. That's not anything novel. But in your case, you strip that entirely out.
Yeah, players absolutely focus on the slams. They've written it, they've said it. We all know they do. And so we know that's true. But what I'm aiming for again is to look at who was playing the best tennis at the most part of the time. And if it were true that it were effective for players to focus on the slams more, there would be certain players who outperform at slams consistently. Right. And we know there are a handful of players who have better resumes at slams than otherwise, like Stan Wawrinka. But there are very, very few players who you can say, this is a slam plus player. Like, this is the kind of guy where you can just count on him to do better at a slam than other tournaments. You can count on him to do worse away from slams. We might know that it's true for Stan, maybe, but if you look at every player in the history of tennis, there's so few players like that they look like statistical outliers. We can't treat that as a reliable statistical signal. So what that means to me is, I don't want to say Stan got lucky. Luck is a super, super loaded word, but you can't look at a guy and say he won a couple slams, but he only won one Masters title or something. You can't look at that and say, that's because he focused really hard. That's because he really cared about slams more than the other players really cared about slams. So if I had to have a theory as to why that is that everybody's raising their game for the slams. So if Nadal and Medvedev play each other in Australia in the final, and then they play each other a month later in Acapulco, maybe they both are trying harder. Maybe they both are better prepared in Australia, but they're better prepared to the same amount. So what that means in the long run is that Acapulco match actually does tell you as much about how they play relative to each other, how good they are relative to each other, than the Australian match does. I can see you shaking your head. I know.
Yeah, it's not the Medvedev Nadal match in Acapulco. It's the someone who's lower ranked than Medvedev, who's super fired up to play Nadal in Acapulco. And Rafa just, for example, won the Australian and he's tired and blah, 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 blah. And this guy, top 50, is all fired up. This is his Super Bowl, right? This is his Super Bowl. So he's going to be extra fired up at an event like that where Rafa and Rafa's a bad example because he tries everywhere, but we're just hypothetically giving an example. I don't know if they're trying as much or trying as equal. And I asked Steve the same thing at those lower level events where a guy a little bit lower ranked, that is their Super Bowl whenever they play a Novak, a Fed, or a Rafa.
They just don't win very often, though. That's the thing. I mean, I agree. Like, they're definitely trying, but it doesn't work. I mean, I think you'd see it more, I think, the further back in history you go. So and what I've noticed, this is something I'm going to figure out how to write about, is when you get to a certain level of greatness, every loss has a reason or an excuse or something. So if you think about Nadal's career, and excuse is another loaded word. I'm not saying their excuse is like a bad thing, but if you talk to a Nadal fan and you go through a list of every one of his career losses, that fan can tell you why he lost every one. And some of them will sound like excuses. Some of them will sound like bad luck, whatever. He has so few losses and they're such big news that we think we know why. Same thing with Fed, with Djokovic, with every great player. I was just going through newspaper clippings about Rod Laver in 1962, and there are news reporters in 1962 when Laver lost in the quarterfinals of a tournament. It was the exact same thing. It was like, What happened, Rod? I mean, how did you possibly lose this one? You won, 27 straight before this. What happened? And there was a reason. He had played too much tennis, or he was jet lagged. Like a serious Rod Laver fan has an excuse for every one of those. And again, there's so few. So those guys who are having their Super Bowl, they win sometimes. I think it kind of comes out in the wash. The very best players of all time, they all lose those matches occasionally. We think we know why. A Nadal fan might say that, Nadal's losses like that are more unlucky or more because of guys coming out firing than Djokovic's were. I don't know. I mean, I wouldn't even venture an estimate about that, but we have a lot of stories to explain individual matches, but those stories often don't stand up when we try to come up with overarching theories that will explain every player or every era.
So I do, and we want to mention a couple more of these, but I think having your background, having listened to your background now, I think I understand specifically why you have someone like Boris Becker at 32, Andre Agassi at 38. Obviously, Agassi has the 8 slams. He has the Olympics. He has the career slam. He's 10-4 versus Boris head to head. But again, he had some bad years, and that obviously weighed into the algorithm that you created. Does that explain that placement of those two players?
Yeah, that's part of it. And Agassi, I mean, I was surprised too when the rankings came out the way they did. And when I started digging into his record, it's really surprising looking at who his slam finals were against. I mean, he had some great matches against Pete. He got some wins against Pete. But if you look at his slam finals, they're not a really impressive collection. I mean, didn't he win one against Arnaud Clément? I mean, there's a few pretty weak ones. And again, I mean, I hate even veering into the territory of seeming like I'm trying to tear down Andre Agassi, because it's freaking Andre Agassi here. Of course, he's amazing. He's one of the 35 or 36 best players of all time, 38, I guess. Let's say top 40. Amazing player, maybe under different circumstances. Maybe if the drugs hadn't been around for him to sample, then maybe he would have been top 20. He definitely could have been, but I mean, the way things panned out, a lot of the wins that we remember as padding those career totals, the really amazing moments, they weren't against the strongest possible competition. And that's the difference between 38 and 28.
And I mean, you're not doing that. You're not, when you say Boris is 32, Agassi is 38, you're not looking at that head to head, because Agassi beat him 10-4. I mean, he owned him. He had one bad loss against him at Wimbledon, but again, you're looking at a much bigger body of work than just head to head. So you can't isolate that and say Boris is 32, Agassi is 38, because he's better than Agassi head to head. You can't. And
it's also not going to work. Like, you're going to have places where, player A is better than player B is better than player C, but player C is better than player A. I mean, you can't turn tennis history into a ladder. And yeah, like you say, like these players, almost all of them have 1,000 career matches. Rod Laver has 2,000 career matches. So those 14, Agassi versus Becker, they're more important than a random grouping of 14 you pick out, for sure. But they're still just 14 out of 1,000. So I mean, even if you weight them 10 times as much as the average match, it's still a pretty small part of the calculation for these guys.
So Jeff,
I want to pass. Oh, go ahead, Steve.
Sorry. That brings an interesting thought to mind. Everybody looking at the iconic trio today of Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal. And it looks like, unless there's a bunch more matches with Rafa, where Rafa beats Novak a few times on clay and manages to edge ahead of him for their careers, that Djokovic will end up with a winning record. He right now 30-29 against Rafa and 27-23 against Roger. Those statistics, that you didn't weigh that in when you were looking at this, that really wasn't a part of your thinking at all, was it? Based on what you're saying now about Becker versus Agassi, the fact that Djokovic might end up, or probably will end up, with a winning record against his two chief rivals would not weigh into the equation if you were doing this same thing for just this era. If your rank, if it wasn't a 128 of all time, but it was top 10 of the Djokovic, Federer, and Nadal era, as an example, head-to-head would be insignificant to you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, those matches kind of go in the soup like any other matches. And obviously, like the way ELO works, if Djokovic beats Nadal, Nadal's one of the best players around. Every time Djokovic gets one of those wins, he gets a lot of points for it, just like Nadal gets a lot of points for beating Djokovic. But another factor there is, it's the same thing with the slam count right now. They're pretty small margins. I mean, 30-29, 23 slams to 22 to 20, or whatever we're at any given time. to me, like thinking of it in terms of stat categories that aren't so much in the headlines, those are basically rounding errors. I mean, I know that's sacrilege, someone who really cares about the slam total of the Nadal Djokovic head to head, but 30-29, that's a tie. I mean, come on. I mean, I get that goes on the Hall of Fame plaque and there's a lot of bragging rights involved, but if you're trying to rate how good a player is compared to another player, 30-29 is a tie. 23 slams to 22 slams or 21-20, that's a tie. I mean,
I think to Steve's point too, Jeff, that you can't put the head-to-head in isolation, but indirectly it plays a big factor because these guys are beating each other in late stages, often semis and finals of the slam. So while you don't isolate it head-to-head, indirectly in your algo, it does affect it because the fact is they're playing each other in semis and finals of slams.
Absolutely. I mean, and the fact is they're playing each other a ton. So I was saying with Becker and Agassi, it's 14 matches out of 1,000. Well, Djokovic and Nadal, it's 60 matches out of 1,000 or 1,200 or whatever. I mean, it's still not a huge number, but they do count for more as on a weighted basis. And that starts to add up to something. I mean, 60 matches is a lot, whether it's against Djokovic or somebody else. So, I mean, absolutely. That has a lot to do with the numbers they ended up with. It just doesn't matter a lot whether it's 30-29 or 29-30 or 31-28. It's all pretty much a big vote that says these guys are all really good and they're pretty close to each other in the rankings.
I want to pass the next topic off to Steve because we'll talk about Steffi at 2, Martina at 3, Serena at 6, because I can promise you, I've known Steve for a while now. He hasn't done any of the algorithm stuff that you have done in your system, Jeff, but it's interesting to me in that in conversations with Steve, along with our conversation with Chris Yavert, Steve's order of that is somewhat similar to what you have. He did not automatically appoint Serena as the greatest of all time when you're talking about Martina and Steffi. And Steve, I'll pass it on to you.
Jeff, I don't know how much of that podcast you heard, but it was an interesting discussion we had with Chrissy regarding Serena versus Steffi and Martina. And she made the case and some people look at it this way. Serena at her best beats anybody. You know, when she was at her very best, I can't see anybody beating her. She didn't come out and say that necessarily made Serena the greatest of all time, but it was a case of sorts. And yet obviously others look at it. I tend to look at it more toward the weight of the record, the historical record, what they've achieved across their entire career. Martina going 5 years and losing 14 matches to me was astounding, from 82 to 86, 70 out of 84 titles. Steffi having many similar seasons, winning the Grand Slam, which Serena didn't do. So I found it very interesting that your tables turned up the way they did, because as you know, when Serena retired and played the US Open, and every match she walked out on the court, they announced her as the greatest of all time. It's hard to kind of get away from that because it's always the great player right in front of us now that must be the greatest of all time. I understand all that. But what I found interesting was it was similar to the way I think and the way a lot of experts think, very close between Graf and Navratilova, with Graf perhaps getting the nod and then Serena behind them. So talk about these factors from your end. I'm looking at it from the standpoint of experts or great players or thinkers and how they evaluate it in a big picture thinking. Talk about it from your standpoint of your system, why it did come out that way with Graf, Navratilova, and Williams.
Yeah, one of the biggest things is what you already mentioned, those just amazing runs at Steffi's peak and Martina's peak, where they basically didn't lose. I mean, it's just unreal, the years they strung together where they're losing just 2 or 3 matches. And I mean, Serena had some great seasons too. She's right up there, which is why she's number 3 among women on the list. The difference, though, that surprised me a lot when I started working on this list, and I really dug into it to make sure I wasn't doing the math wrong or had some buggy data in there somewhere, is how strong the late 80s, early mid 90s era for women came out. I mean, if you look at the rest of the list, that's a lot of the big surprises. So I've got Conchita Martinez in the top 50. And I mean, some people think I'm completely off my rocker for having Conchita that high, or having Gabriela Sabatini with her less than impressive slam record at number 31. People think I'm equally off my rocker there. And if you put that all together, what I'm really saying is that era that Steffi was dominating, that was an incredible era. And I think a lot of people who were there, or people who were growing up then and remember Steffi dominating the field, they've concluded from what they remember that it was a weak era, that Steffi was so good because there wasn't strong competition. And that is not what I turned up at all. So a big difference between Martina, Steffi, and Serena is that Steffi had her peak at the beginning, perhaps, of a very strong era. Martina, I mean, some of those years in the early mid 80s were not that strong, but much of Martina's career, of course, her 80 matches against Chrissy, I mean, just incredibly difficult competition. And Serena had her rivals, but not quite up there. So, I mean, even if you say their records are identical, which they aren't quite, but even if we stipulate their records are identical, my numbers say Steffi did it against the toughest competition, Martina did it against slightly easier competition, and Serena did it against easier competition still. That's
let me stop you there, Jeff. How do you objectify? So like, okay, I think everyone's in agreement. Martina and Chrissy, they were making the semis and finals of every tournament they played. I think we're all in agreement with that. But how do you say, and this isn't disagreeing with you, this is just a question. How do you say that Steffi's era was tougher than Serena's era? Maybe Serena's era was amazing. Serena was just that much better. Like, how do you classify that and say the body of work was tougher competition when Steffi was playing versus Serena?
It's tough. It's even tougher for me to explain. So I'm going to try. I'm not great at communicating this, but a good way to think about it is that every 2 consecutive seasons have a lot of overlap, right? I mean, it's mostly the same players, but there's some differences, right? I mean, one year, a couple of years ago, Carlos Alcaraz showed up and suddenly the field was a little tougher, or Federer leaves and the field is a little easier. So what you can do is take the players from, say, 2018, who also played in 2019, and see how they do in those 2 years. I mean, you should adjust for their age, because the ones who are getting older, they should do a little worse. The ones who are approaching retirement, they'll do a little worse. The ones who are approaching their peak will do a little better. But in general, the same group of players in 2 consecutive years, you'd expect them to play the same way. They're the same players, right? But they don't quite. And the reason why, at least one reason why, is because the field they're playing against is just a little bit different. One year might have Federer, one year might have a young Alcaraz, one year might have none of the above. So for every set of 2 consecutive seasons, you can say, okay, the people who came back for the next year, they're a little better in year 2, or they're a little worse in year 2. And if they're a little better in year 2, that means the era is just a little bit weaker. And if you do that for every 2 seasons for all of tennis history, then you get this, up and down sort of a wave where sometimes the era is getting stronger, sometimes it's getting weaker. And what you get is this bulge in the Steffi era. It's just unbelievable that somehow you end up with Conchita Martinez as one of the top 50 players of all time. And I realize, like I said, people think I'm off my rocker, that maybe there's an algorithm that would give you different results, but mine is pretty clear that if you look at those year-to-year comparisons, those are the years that were the toughest for those same players to continue competing at the same level. So the few players who did, like Sabatini and Conchita, and of course Steffi Graf, that's why they come out so high, is because that era does look so strong.
That's interesting.
Sorry, David. Sorry. One of the things that struck me, Jeff, that I really did like was the balance of the eras, not only the balance of men and women, but the eras. And for instance, Tennis Channel did, as you know, about 10 years before you, they did a list. There were many similarities. I mean, they had Federer, Laver, Graf, Navratilova, Sampras as the top 5. So 4 of those top 5 were the same as yours. And Chrissy was 9 on your list, 9 on their list, as an example. But what I liked the most about yours was that you had Tilden at number 7 and Helen Wills Moody at 10. So 2 of the great players of 20s heading in and 30s, the dominant figures of American tennis and the worldwide game, are in your top 10, which was not the case with Tennis Channel, which weighted more on the modern players. talk about how that came about, how you evaluated the information, because you're talking about difficulty of errors. There's no doubt in my mind that they belong there. But on the other hand, the competition was not the same from top to bottom in the 20s and 30s as was the case decades down the road. So explain how you think they turned up in the top 10, which I think is terrific.
Yeah, I mean, mostly it's just the algorithm I've been talking about, and that's how it shook out. I mean, when I started doing ELO ratings for earlier eras, the tricky thing with ELO ratings is when a new player enters the tour, let's say somebody plays their first pro match, then we have to give them a rating. We don't know anything about them. So in ELO terms, we typically give them a rating of 1500. Doesn't matter what the number is, but we give them a sort of arbitrary rating. Now, if you go back to the beginning of tennis history, or let's just say 1920, 1919, after World War I, the average person showing up for their first tournament is very different than someone showing up for their first pro tournament now. I mean, someone showing up for their first, even if it's like qualies at an ITF Sharm el Sheikh, like that person's way more prepared than someone showing up and, who happens to belong to the local club at, the Gypsy Club in London, where the Wimbledon warm-up was held. So, I mean, you can't treat everyone in all eras as being equal. So what I did is I did a lot of testing and a lot of math to figure out what that level should be. And I came up with a much lower level. So, I mean, the number that somebody starts with, if they suddenly appear on tour in 1919, is way, way, way lower than the number that someone starts with when they show up at, like I say, ITF qualies now. But what it does is it gives you ELO ratings that are stable throughout history. So by adding the years 1920 to 1970, I don't end up changing the ratings now, or I don't end up having, Bill Tilden look like a scrub, or have Bill Tilden look like, an incredible tennis machine, 1,000 points better than anyone else. And I designed it specifically the way I did so that all of tennis history was roughly equal, subject to those era fluctuations I was talking about. And to me, I think that's the only way you can do this. If you're going to do 100 years of tennis history, yes, there's some differences in eras, but you can't just say, I mean, the beginning was not that great. And just like you would never do a baseball ranking and say, well, I mean, Babe Ruth was a great and all, but baseball wasn't that good in the 20s. We've learned a lot since then. So let's knock Babe down to number 38. I mean, that's crazy. You can't do that. So I mean, to me, it's the same thing. Like if I had come up with a list and Tilden and Wills and Longland were all outside the top 40, like I think I would have gone back to the drawing board and come up with a new formula, because it doesn't tally for me. And it's not, I don't think it's what you should be trying to do if you're trying to rate 100 years of tennis history.
When it came to your upper crust, Jeff, how thin a line was there between Laver and Graf? I mean, there's your top two. And Laver was not nearly as consistent as Steffi week in, week out, obviously. But he reached these dizzying heights and is the only player ever to win 2 Grand Slams, etc. So how thin was the gap between Laver, Graf, Navratilova, Djokovic, Federer, your top 5? What was it exceedingly tight among those 5?
It was, in some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Laver's peak is so much higher than any other man, at least according to my ratings. Just outrageous. I mean, it's in ELO terms, he's almost 100 points higher at his peak than any other man, and that's enormous. Graf is something like 20 points higher than Navratilova in their peaks, to give you an idea. So no one's touching Laver. I mean, people occasionally ask me what does Djokovic have to do to catch up with Laver on this list? Like, I mean, I don't know. Play another 5 years and win 12 more slams. I don't know exactly what it is, but it's a lot.
Jeff, let me interrupt you a second. Yeah. Let me just interrupt you 1 second. I get you on that, but as an example, with Djokovic, by having just won the Australian, adding another major to his title, how much closer does that bring him to Navratilova, as an example, for 3 and 4?
Not too much. And going back to how the algorithm was constructed, like I said, there's those 3 pieces. One is the player's peak, one is the player's best 7 years, one is the career. All Djokovic is doing right now is padding the career. So it's really just 1/3 of his rating. And that counts for something, but I mean, Laver to Graf is a big gap. Graf and Navratilova are very, very close. I looked really, really hard at that one and double checked all my numbers and on and on. And I mean, Graf is solidly above Navratilova, but I mean, we're talking a sliver. But then Navratilova to Djokovic is pretty wide. Djokovic and Federer are pretty close. I think Rafa and Chrissy were surprisingly close, which I thought was interesting, given they're the respective clay goats of their tours. After that, you've got a lot that are pretty close, but whether it's Djokovic or someone else who's padding their career totals, like I say, it only contributes to 1/3 of their ratings unless they're setting a new standard, and unless Djokovic, has an undefeated season or something and sets a new level for peak play in the men's game. So it's unless Navratilova comes back and makes another successful comeback, then there's not much happening at the top of the list for a long time.
Jeff, I want to ask you how the algo deals with this, and then I'll pass it on to Steve for some final thoughts, because we can talk about this for hours. This is fascinating stuff. But something that Steve and I talked about, and this is basically, you can blame your parents for the year you were born, but 4, 5, and 6 on the men's side during when Rafa, Novak, and Fed were relatively all at their peaks, right? If you're 4th, 5th, and 6th in any industry, right, you're pretty damn good. But the top 3, the big 3, were so much better than 4, 5, and 6. Did 4, 5, and 6 get penalized because they're not winning slams during this era versus 4, 5, and 6 in any other era? Probably could have won at least a few slams, right? It's the kind of like you're getting penalized for the year you're born, basically.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways of coming up with a yes and a no answer to that question. I mean, literally no, they're not being penalized in the sense that going back to the percent of the matches they're playing. So somebody like David Ferrer, he played a lot of matches against the big 3 or the big 4. I mean, lots of matches. It definitely hurt his career totals, no question. But still, he comes out as 70 on my list, somewhere around there. Maybe not 70, 79. So yeah. He's above a lot of slam winners. He's above a handful of multi-slam winners. He's above Leighton Hewitt, for example. That's one of those cases where a lot of people thought I was maybe going a little bit bonkers with these numbers. So whatever people thought was the appropriate number for Ferrer, it was lower than what I gave him. I mean, Wawrinka, that's another one people have let me know what they think about, but Wawrinka has very little of a career record outside of his slams, outside of a few wins over Djokovic, and he ends up on this list. So you can do very well. I think the way you answer that question with a big yes is to say that they would have developed differently otherwise. So, I mean, maybe if Nadal hadn't been there and Ferrer had gained some early confidence, or if Nadal had just been a year or two later and Ferrer had broken through at the 05 or 06 French Open and gotten that confidence, maybe developed it a little different game style, or the game had evolved differently around him instead of around Rafa. I mean, you can imagine a lot of counterfactuals where Ferrer ends up as a great of the game, or even Wawrinka does. Or I would love it if we could have a counterfactual where Tsonga was the great of the era. He was my favorite of the also rans, but I don't know. Like, they had a lot of chances. Like Murray, for example, no one's going to say Murray's better than the big 3. I mean, there's no debate there. But he did make it very clear that he's better than the rest of the pack, and my algorithm put him in the top 30, which, I mean, again, is pretty aggressive compared to what I think most people expected. So you could, in the era of the big 3, come up with an all-time great resume. The other guys didn't. I mean, the field was open for Ferrer or Tsonga or Wawrinka or Berdych or a half dozen other guys to do what Murray did. And they didn't. So, I mean, if Federer hadn't been there, it would have been easier, but they didn't.
There's a whole bunch of players that are pissed off at their parents for having them when they did. I can promise you that.
No, Jeff, I feel like it's up to these players. I mean, for instance, David is a great admirer of Agassi's, and Agassi and Sampras had an illustrious rivalry. But they played 5 major finals. Sampras wins 4 of them. So, I mean, to me, it's kind of up to you as a great player to deal with your opposition. It was up to Andy Murray if he wanted it to be a genuine big 4. And I know some people make that argument of a big 4 versus a big 3, which I don't agree with. Then I think you have to put up the numbers. And what's interesting about Murray, Jeff, is that people forget that back in the 2012, he beat Murray in the Olympics. He beat, Andy beat Novak in the Olympics. He beat him in the US Open final. And the next year he beat him in the Wimbledon final. So at that stage, he was faring rather well with Djokovic. It all changed comprehensively after that. And I just feel like same thing with Agassi and Sampras, same thing with Roddick and Federer. A lot of Roddick supporters felt like, look, if it wasn't for Roger, Andy would have won all. Well, but wasn't it up to Andy to step up? Did you look at that angle when you did your rankings in your ELO system?
I mean, not explicitly, but what I was pleasantly surprised by when the rankings first came up on my screen was how well some of those also ran sort of players do. And again, I'm using ridiculous terms like Roddick's not also ran, but in the way we're talking about right now, I mean, he's not in the GOAT debate, and maybe he would have been if Federer hadn't come along when he did. Maybe he would have won 4 Wimbledons in a row, maybe. But I think that the fact that he only accomplished what he did meant that people would have expected him to be further outside of the top 100 or something on my list. And he wasn't. He's number 80 right next to Federer. So there's a lot of people on this list who won 1 slam or even 0 slams who had that kind of talent. Maybe they came along at the wrong time, or they were unlucky in major finals, or whatever happened. I mean, to me, like, the things we focus on, like the top line stats, slams, weeks at number 1, maybe masters, or the big head-to-heads, like they try to boil players' careers down to a small number of data points. And my approach is the opposite. My approach is saying we have 1,000 data points on these guys. Like, okay, Roddick wasn't lucky that he came up at the same time as Federer did, but he didn't play that many matches against Federer. He lost them all, but he had 1,000 other chances to establish his greatness. And he did. I mean, not as much as he could have, but he absolutely did. Same with Federer, same with Conchita Martinez with her bad birthday luck. And by using ELO, you can look at all 1,000 matches. I mean, I don't think any human brain, certainly not mine, can balance all that stuff and say, I'm going to look at Conchita's 1,000 matches and decide where she should rank. But a computer can. And I was pleasantly surprised by what my computer said about some of these players who had bad birthday luck and would have been better maybe in another era, but according to my rankings, were pretty darn good anyway.
Fascinating. Again, we could talk about this for hours, Steve. I mean, I could have so many more questions to ask, but I'll leave it to Steve for any final thoughts.
No, I just would say I believe that this was it's a worthy discussion, and I'm glad the listeners had a chance to hear more from you. Some of them may have glanced at your rankings, some of them may have examined them comprehensively, but I think they have a better, a clearer idea now, our listeners do on this podcast, of how you went about your rankings and why they evolved the way they did. And I do think that the fascinating thing to me about it is that there were so many similarities between your list and the Tennis Channel list of 10 years ago in terms of the top places, and that you somehow managed to make it so equally balanced between men and women and the different eras. And that's what I think is the greatest testament to what you did is the balance. And I commend you for that.
Thanks.
Incredible, Jeff. Thanks for your time. This was great. Keep doing what you're doing. This was a ton of fun. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.